Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the Minister of Advanced Education.
I ask for leave for an extended introduction.
Ministers asked for extended introductions. Leave granted. Recognize the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To you and through all members of the Assembly, I have the honour of introducing a couple of special guests who have laid their lives on the line to serve in Canada's armed forces. These individuals have been awarded the Saskatchewan Scholarship of Honour to pursue post-secondary education. 4 recipients are here with us today, seated in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to welcome, if you wouldn't mind just giving a wave as I call your name, Corporal Curtis Bear of Regina, who served on Operation Nanook and is now attending the University of Regina to obtain a Bachelor of Science. Captain Corinne Haig of Nipawin, who served in Operation Reassurance and is now attending the University of Calgary to obtain a Master's and PhD in Social Work. Sergeant Sean Mihailshan of Saskatoon, who served on the Joint Task Force Afghanistan-Kandahar and is now attending the University of Saskatchewan to obtain a Bachelor of Law. And finally, Bombardier Devin Pierce of Regina, who served on Operation Palachi and is now attending the University of Regina to attain a Bachelor of Arts. Mr. Speaker, the Scholarship of Honour is awarded to returning Canadian Armed Forces members, as well as the spouse and children of those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Saskatchewan is the only province to offer such a scholarship. I would like to also acknowledge those recipients who could not be with us today. Gregory Baker, Daniel Bertolin, Genevieve Baroque, Tara Collins, the wife of Corporal Charles Mears, Eric Dufour, the child of Kenneth Dufour, Alana Hay, the child of Norman Hay, Robert Haroldson, Dakota Karolik, Aidan McKenzie, Eric Mihalski, Kathleen Perry, Dayton Parapoint, Caitlin Reynolds, the child of Andrew Reynolds, Andrew Sims, Christopher Singer, Courtney Sunways, Robert Stevens, Lindsay Stoddard, the child of Trevor Stoddard, Tyler Stoddard, the child of Trevor Stoddard, Blair Turner, Tyler West, Rowan Wilson, and Keith Wolgamuth. Mr. Speaker, these individuals deserve our utmost gratitude and respect. I would like to personally thank you for your service to our country and congratulate you on receiving the Scholarship of Honour. I wish you the very best in continuing your studies wherever you called home. Next Sunday, on Remembrance Day, people throughout the country will gather together to remember, to honour, and to pay gratitude to those who have served us, and I want to thank you on behalf of the government. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take this opportunity to join with the Minister and paying both our gratitude and our respect to the members of the armed forces that are with us here today, and congratulate them on this honour, the receiving of the SAS Scholarship of Honour. To you and to your families and to all of those who were not able to be with us today but were also recipients. To have you here, especially this week ahead of Remembrance Day, it is a very special honor indeed to be able to welcome you to your Legislative Assembly and to say thank you, a very earnest thank you for all of your sacrifice, and wish you all well in your studies as you go forward. So on behalf of the official opposition, thank you, gratitude and respect.
Recognize the Minister of Corrections and the member for Wascana Plains.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members of this Assembly. We have here today 24 grade 4 students from W.S. Harlock Schools seated in the West Gallery, accompanied by their teacher, Megan DaCosta, and their parent chaperones, Nadine Hagan and Kara Cross. Thank you for being here today, and I'll be speaking to you in a little while. Thank you very much.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to introduce two guests in your gallery from the Provincial Association of Transition Houses, the Executive Director, Joanne Dussel, and Crystal Giesbrick, Director of Research and Communications. These people are here today for the introduction of the Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol, which is known as Clare's Law, and we're grateful to them for the work that they do, not just with regard to supporting this, but the work that they do to try and make our citizens safe, some of the people that are going through some of the most tragic and difficult times in their lives. For that, we thank them, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to join with the Minister in welcoming Crystal and Joanne to their Legislative Assembly, both strong advocates for survivors of intimate partner violence in Saskatchewan. Both do amazing work. So great to see the two of you here today. They're fantastic advocates, and it's always a pleasure to see them and to learn about the work that they do. Looking forward to seeing the legislation coming out shortly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask all members to join me in welcoming them to their Legislative Assembly.
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members of the Assembly, I have the honour of welcoming a couple of important guests seated in your gallery. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce from the Adoption Support Centre of Saskatchewan Executive Director Sylvia Holonick, if you can give us a wave, and Resource Director Lee Deans. They are here to celebrate Adoption Awareness Month in Saskatchewan. Recently, I had the chance to join the organization for their 30th anniversary. They hosted an all-age magic show, and I had the honor of bringing a very short greetings as I was standing between the children that were in the movie theater and the Ginger Ninja, who was a magician, Mr. Speaker. So it was great to see so many families out participating in this event. Mr. Speaker, it's incredible that the Adoption Support Centre got its start in 1988 from a group of adoptive parents providing support to one another. Today, they have grown into a province-wide confidential services that provides pre- and post-adoption information and support for domestic, international, private, step-parent, and adult adoptions. What they do here, Mr. Speaker, is changing lives. I'd like to welcome both Sylvia and Lee to their Assembly today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to join the Minister of Social Services and welcome Sylvia and Lee to their legislature. The work, of course, as the Minister said, and we all agree, very, very important work for the children and adult adoptees and all of this. And with the Adoption Resource Centre, very important features. So I would ask all members to join in welcoming Sylvia and Lee to their legislature. Thank you.
Recognize Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I would like to introduce a member in your gallery. He is the Mayor of Torquay, Mike Strachan. Mike Strachan and I go back a few years, back to our Air Cadet days together. I was his leader and he was my cadet, so I would like to take credit for him becoming the Mayor of Torquay. No, actually, he's a great person for the province of Saskatchewan. He works on his area transportation planning committee. He's worked with SaskDocs. He's worked on several committees, and I just like this assembly to welcome him here in our house today. Thank you.
Again, as a member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's an honour to join with the member opposite to welcome the Mayor of Torquay, Mike Strachan, to his Assembly. Also a Vice President or a leadership position with SUMA for a number of years within our province, and I thank him for that. Just a couple weeks ago, I was just a couple kilometres away from Torquay as I was pursuing some beautiful pheasant, Mr. Speaker, out in the field. I recall a few years ago being down in Torquay. I wasn't supposed to be right in Torquay, but the vehicle had failed while out in a late season pheasant hunt. Ended up having to walk into Torquay when there was big blizzard that was happening. And the 50 and over club in Torquay kicked into gear and brought my hunting group, put together sandwiches and soup, had music going. It was a fabulous afternoon, actually much more enjoyable than being in the field that afternoon. But I ask all members to welcome the Mayor of Torquay, Mike Strachan, to his Assembly. And while still on my feet, seated in your gallery, I want to welcome some leaders within our community and within our province to their Assembly. These are leaders within 5890, the steelworkers local that represents Evraz Steel, I want to welcome President Mike Day to his assembly. I want to introduce and welcome Tori Sand to his assembly, and I want to welcome Patrick Vigneault with the Steelworkers to his assembly. These are good people that are working hard for their members, but working hard for our province, and that for generations have been an integral part of building Canada and certainly building our community. I've watched steelworkers in action for years within our community as coaches, as volunteers, and so much more, and it's an honor to welcome these leaders to their assembly here today.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. And I have an introduction as well. So I'd like to inform the Assembly that Ann Drake, one of our procedural clerks, is participating in a professional development program with the table officers and will be periodically at the table throughout the session. Please join me in welcoming Ann to the chamber. Presenting petitions. What's that? I recognize a member for Saskatoon Eastview.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise and present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. As we know, this is a tax on anything that would move in this province, and it would devastate our economy. As we have guests from Everett Steel today, they would realize that this carbon tax would cut production at that plant and would hurt our economy out throughout Saskatchewan. We will not wave the white flag. We will fight them in Regina. We'll fight in Ottawa. We will win this fight, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan takes the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on this province. Mr. Speaker, this petition has been signed by the citizens of Saskatoon. I do so present.
I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to present a petition in support of mental health and addiction services in the North. My colleague, the member from Athabasca, and myself have attended too many funerals of many of our young community members and those that have committed suicide, mental health addictions. So, we're here to present a petition on behalf of many. Northern Saskatchewan has some of the highest suicide rates in the country. The Children's Advocate has put out a report stating the lack of service in the North. The suicide rate is 6 times higher for First Nation boys than non-First Nation boys between the ages of 10 and 19, and 26 times higher for First Nation girls than non-First Nation girls. The prayer reads, we in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to treat Northern Saskatchewan residents with respect and dignity, and to immediately invest in more mental health and wellness programs and facilities in the North. It is signed by many good people of Northern Saskatchewan. I so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Newtana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to present a petition calling for a public inquiry into the GTH land deal. The people who have signed this petition want to bring to the Assembly's attention the following. Sask Party has refused to come clean on the GTH land deal, a deal where Sask Party insiders made millions flipping land and taxpayers lost millions. The Sask Party continues to block key witnesses from providing testimony about the land deal, and it is Saskatchewan people who footed the bill for the GTH land deal and deserve nothing less than the truth. I'll read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to stop hiding behind partisan excuses and immediately call for a judicial inquiry and a forensic audit into the GTH land deal. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this today are from the City of Regina. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to present a petition for a private bill on behalf of petitioners from the City of Saskatoon. The prayer of the petition requests to the Honourable Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan in Legislature assembled. The petition of the undersigned St. Andrews College of the Province of Saskatchewan humbly showeth that the St. Andrews College was duly incorporated by an act of the Legislature of Saskatchewan, being Chapter 157 of the Statutes of Saskatchewan 1972, that St. Andrews College is desirous of amending the said act to amend the purposes and objects of St. Andrew College and reflect its current administrative procedures. Wherefore, your petitioners humbly pray that your Honourable Assembly may be pleased to amend an act to amend and consolidate an act respecting St. Andrew's College, being an act to amend and consolidate an act to incorporate the Presbyterian Theological College of Saskatoon, being Chapter 157 the Statutes of Saskatchewan 1972 accordingly, and as in duty bound your petitioner will ever pray. Mr. Speaker, I do so present. Thank you.
Pursuant to Rule 101, this petition is referred to the Standing Committee on Private Bills. Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the Minister, member from Humboldt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand with a heavy heart as we remember a very special and important community member. Elgar Peterson passed away this Saturday. Elgar was a pillar in our community. He was always involved and he was always around the hockey rink. Whether he was helping kids tie their skates or staying late at night to make sure recreation games ran smoothly, he was there for his community. Elgar was born in 1936 in Anaheim, Saskatchewan, a village just northeast of Humboldt. He began volunteering with minor hockey when he moved to Humboldt in 1962. When the Broncos were founded in 1970, Elgar became the team's trainer and equipment manager. Mr. Speaker, Elgar had made a major impact on generations of families in Humboldt. Elgar was a special needs individual, but his spirit and his demeanor, his positive attitude was contagious. The community embraced and loved him, and he loved the community back. To thank him for his work over the years, the hockey arena was named after Elgar to honor him and his dedication to the community of Humboldt. My community has experienced great loss in the past 8 months, ever since that day in April, and our hearts have never quite fully mended, but Elgar is now with his Broncos. He will be deeply loved and deeply missed.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Saskatoon Services for Seniors is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to providing supports that enable older adults and those with physical challenges to reside independently in their own homes for as long as possible. During the Fringe Festival this year, Saskatoon Services for Seniors, along with a group of young people, created the Elder Wisdom YXE Bench project to recognize the value that seniors have in our community. Modeled after similar projects in Ontario, it was a simple idea to have a park bench with the words Elder Wisdom YXE on it to be an invitation to have a seat with a senior. It was an exciting opportunity to have conversations about and with Saskatoon's older population and to help bridge the gap between youth and seniors. The bench hosted a diverse group of seniors in the community, ranging in age from 75 to 101, and along with special guests, they all participated as bench ambassadors to share stories and wisdom that have been gained through age and experience. The bench was in place during the August long weekend and the following Saturday. Seniors often face isolation in their own communities, and by placing the bench at events that were more geared towards a younger crowd, this project benefited young people, seniors, and our community as a whole. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all members join me in acknowledging this important public awareness project focused on raising awareness about seniors' experiences and giving seniors the opportunity to share their wisdom. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Wallshakers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Saskatchewan has a strong history of men and women serving in Canada's armed forces. Mr. Speaker, these courageous people have laid their lives on the line to protect our country and our freedoms. And to thank them, our government created the Scholarship of Honor. This scholarship was announced in 2009, created to honor the sacrifices made by members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Currently, Saskatchewan is the only province to offer this type of scholarship. The Scholarship of Honor is awarded each year to returning Canadian Forces members or to a family member of a fallen or injured soldier. The scholarship is $5,000 and is available to all eligible candidates to pursue post-secondary studies. Mr. Speaker, since 2009, there have been 206 recipients of this scholarship. This year, 27 recipients have been awarded the Scholarship of Honor, and today we recognize those heroes. Mr. Speaker, seated in the House today are Sergeant Sean Mahalshan, Bombardier Devin Pierce, Captain Corrine Haig, and Corporal Curtis Bear, who is also currently a resident of Walsh Acres. Because of these brave men and women, we live in a country of freedom and peace, and for that, we are eternally grateful. I'd ask all members to join me in thanking these brave men and women and congratulate them on their Scholarship of Honor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you. This August, Victoria Park in Regina's downtown was the site of the 49th Annual Regina Folk Festival. Despite sweltering temperatures that reached 40 degrees that weekend, the festival was a great success. This year's festival lineup included artists like Tanya Tagaq, Nico Case, Equal, and a showcase from Girls Rock Regina. A notable feat of this year's festival was that 61% of the lineup was fronted by a feminine or non-binary artist, an all-time high for the festival. This is an accomplishment that should be noted and celebrated in a world where equality in the music industry is still a long way away. A study of the top 5 music festivals in North America in 2015 showed that only 13 to 25% of the bands on the lineup had at least one member who identified as female. The Regina Folk Festival also works hard to bring live music to the city of Regina year-round with their concert series. Not only are they able to bring incredible talent to the Queen City, but as someone who's not getting any younger, I greatly appreciate the earlier and punctual start times to shows in their concert series. The Regina Folk Festival's success is largely due to the artistic director and CEO, Sandra Butel, and her dedicated staff who worked year-round to put on the Regina Folk Festival and other concerts throughout the year. Please join me in congratulating Sandra Butel, her staff, and volunteers for another successful festival season.
Recognize the member for Martinsville-Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand in the House today and highlight a brilliant constituent of mine, Shayla Steffen. Mr. Speaker, Shayla attends Martinsville High School. She loves sports, exploring Saskatchewan, playing piano, and science. She recently competed at the Canada-wide Science Fair in Ottawa. Her project was on plant waste and biodegradable bioplastics, which aim to find new ways of using plant waste by turning it into a sustainable plastic using bacteria you can find in your own backyard. Mr. Speaker, I was happy to be able to know the difference between a rock and a leaf when I was taking biology, so I'm fairly impressed. Mr. Speaker, Shayla was awarded a Bronze Medal and Excellence Award, as well as a $1,000 scholarship to Western University. She's in grade 9, Mr. Speaker, and she has certainly created a path for success for her education. Shayla has a history of success at various science fairs, earning high honors at various regional and national science competitions. She's very passionate about conventional plastics and how they affect our environment, and is determined to make a positive impact on our environment. Mr. Speaker, in the future, Shayla plans to study and become an environmental engineer. Mr. Speaker, I ask everyone in this House to help me congratulate Shayla on her great success and wish her the best in the future. Thank you.
I recognize the member from the Battlefords.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I would like to recognize Great West Life, London Life, and Canada Life for their generous donation of $150,000 to support the new Sask Hospital North Battleford. Their donation supports the Saskatchewan Hospital New Beginnings campaign to raise $8 million for medical equipment and furnishings for that facility. In recognition of their support, the fitness room in the new provincial psychiatric hospital will be named the Canada Life Fitness Room. Mr. Speaker, providing timely, high-quality mental health services to Saskatchewan people is a priority for our government. That is why we have committed to replace the century-old Saskatchewan Hospital North Battleford. The new 284-bed facility will replace the existing 156-bed hospital. This new facility will include psychiatric rehabilitation beds and a secure wing for offenders living with mental health issues. Construction of the new facility is substantially complete now, with plans to begin moving current patients to the new facility in a phased approach starting this month. Mr. Speaker, I thank Great West Life, London Life, and Canada Life for their commitment to this hospital and for their support of improved mental health services for Saskatchewan people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Carrot River Valley.
Mr. Speaker, the latest Statistics Canada report shows that in October, Saskatchewan saw the strongest job growth in 4 years. Our year-over-year employment increased by 9,400 jobs. Full-time employment has increased by 5,700 jobs, and part-time employment has increased by 3,700 jobs compared to a year ago. On a monthly basis, seasonally adjusted employment increased by 2,500 jobs from September of 2018. Hear, hear. The opposition leader recently appointed himself the economy critic. Well, Mr. Speaker, here are his economic policies. A carbon tax, which kills jobs. Higher business taxes, which kills jobs. Higher resource royalties, which kill jobs. $15 minimum wage, which kills jobs. Opposing pipelines, which kills jobs. Contrast that plan with the plans from this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We have increased the small business income threshold. Our last budget included the Saskatchewan Value-Added Agriculture Incentive to expand investment in the province. And we created the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive to support a growing tech sector. And somehow, Mr. Speaker, while he's saying we need to be doing more, the Leader of the Opposition has tried to attack us for promoting our province. This government will continue working to bring down internal trade barriers. This government will continue working to expand our trade relationships across the globe because, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will continue standing up for Saskatchewan.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Premier described his decision to change the election dates in 2020 as, quote, a compromise. By extending the mandate of this government by 6 months past what they've earned and leaving just 2 weeks for civic elections, a compromise is exactly right. It compromises our municipal elections. It compromises people's right to choose their representation. It compromises our democracy. And there's more, Mr. Speaker. Along with that decision, we have 2 members over there who are already running for federal seats, and the Premier refuses to urge them to step down. That means those members won't have to resign until the fall of 2019, and their seats will go unfilled for more than a year. If he won't do the right thing now and insist those members step down today, will he at least come to a compromise and commit to calling by-elections in Saskatoon, Eastview, and Regina Walsh Acres when those seats become vacant, or is he just fine with those seats going unrepresented for over a year?
Yeah, here.
I recognize the Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, I most certainly will not. Mr. Speaker, we are following the rules that were set out in legislation, actually, Mr. Speaker, by a committee, the Board of Internal Economy, of which members from both sides of this House sit on, Mr. Speaker, and it's this government that will continue to follow the rules that have been put forward by that committee with representation by both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker, with respect to these, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the compromise that I had alluded to last week and the provincial election date, Mr. Speaker, and the municipal election dates. That compromise came about, Mr. Speaker, from discussions with our partners, Mr. Speaker, to alleviate a challenge that we had put out in legislation in 2012 when we had attempted to work through the conflict that we had with the federal election, Mr. Speaker, and now work through the conflict that arose, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the report from the Chief Election Officer here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, we've worked through those dates, Mr. Speaker, to what we understand is an acceptable level with the Chief Electoral Officer, an acceptable level, Mr. Speaker, with our partners in municipal government, both rural municipal and urban municipal, and the Saskatchewan school boards, Mr. Speaker, and we look forward to the election in the fall of 2020.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier seems to have got a bit lost on his way to that question. So let's make it really straightforward. Is this Premier okay with the constituencies of Saskatoon, Eastview, and Regina Walsh Acres going unrepresented for over a year just because 2 of his friends want better jobs?
Here.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we're following the rules as per set out by the Board of Internal Economy. Mr. Speaker, that has representatives from both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker. It is not uncommon, Mr. Speaker, for people to go on to new jobs, Mr. Speaker, once they are finished politics, Mr. Speaker. There are members that serve on different councils as they come in to serve or run in a provincial election as well, Mr. Speaker. So the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, is we will be obeying the law as it has been set out and put forward by members from both sides of this House, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, that's not the BOIE, that's the Elections Act, and by choosing to abuse the Elections Act for political gains, the Premier is once again showing that he's more interested in campaigning for his Conservative friends than he is in doing his job for the people of Saskatchewan. With us today in the gallery, Mr. Speaker, is Mike Day. Mike Day is the President of United Steelworkers Local 5890 at Evraz Steel, right here in Regina. For Mike and his members, there's a lot to worry about these days. The Trump tariffs on Canadian steel and Canadian pipe are putting hundreds of good-paying jobs at risk, and this government should be working with the federal government to deal with those challenges and get those tariffs dropped. Unfortunately, the member for Meadow Lake skipped out on a national trade meeting just the other day that included an update on Canada-U.S. trade just to score some partisan points. At the same time, the Premier was choosing to head off to Ontario for another photo op with Doug Ford. With so much at stake for workers in our province, will the Premier commit to Mike and other steelworkers that will stop the stunts and get to work for the people of Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the members from Evraz here today, Mr. Day and his members of his organization, Mr. Speaker, that he has no greater advocate than the current government of Saskatchewan in the industry that employs him and his fellow colleagues, Mr. Speaker. We understand that the lack of pipeline capacity in Western Canada, Mr. Speaker, is costing our industry annualized here $7.4 billion each and every year, Mr. Speaker. We understand that, and we will continue to advocate for existing pipeline capacity as well as access to new pipeline and improved pipeline capacity here, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is we have the Minister of Energy that will be traveling to Ottawa next week, yes, adding to our travel costs here in the province, Mr. Speaker, but advocating on ensuring that there are changes or the repeal of Bill C-69, which will disallow this future pipeline capacity, Mr. Speaker, disallow in many ways additional production right at Evraz Steel here in the city of Regina in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We're sending our Ministry of Energy out there to advocate with the Senate and other members of the Government of Canada, working with the Government of Canada, to ensure that we have every opportunity, Mr. Speaker, for our energy sector to thrive and all of the sectors such as our pipe sector, our steel sector here in the city of Regina, and all of those employed, Mr. Speaker, at Evraz Steel have every opportunity to thrive into the future, Mr. Speaker. You have a great advocate in the Government of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know about no greater advocate. There may be no louder advocate and no more ineffective advocate, as this government has made a lot of noise but zero progress for the people of Evraz, people who work at Evraz. The Premier and that Minister need to stop pointing fingers and get to work so the people in Saskatchewan have work to get to. I recently joined, Mr. Speaker, I joined with Mike and members from Evraz to call on this government to develop an evidence-based best before date system for pipelines in this province. This plan would set a schedule for companies to replace the oldest and worst lines, the oldest and worst quality of the over 30,000 kilometers of pipeline that already exist in the province with new Saskatchewan steel, keeping people working and protecting our land and water from dangerous spills. At a time when so many are concerned about pipeline safety, about steel tariffs, and about jobs here at Evraz, will the Premier show that he's willing to act, willing to actually make some movement, take some decisions rather than just making noise, and actually protect our environment and help our economy by replacing pipe with steel made in Regina?
Recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Mr. Speaker, talk about stunts, Mr. Speaker. Let's not forget the Leader of the Opposition, self-proclaimed command economy czar, has publicly questioned whether pipelines are good for the economy and whether they create jobs. And right on cue, he comes out with a plan that would hurt the economy and kill jobs. If just Sask Energy alone, Mr. Speaker, were to replace all its pipes under his harebrained scheme, it would cost $50 billion, and that would be borne by ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. Let's not forget, Energy and Resources has regulated pipelines since 1954. It maintains 24/7 coverage in the field. This year, and that's just to date, Ministry staff have conducted more than 8,000 pipeline well and facility inspections. Funding for IRIS has increased $1.5 million last year. $600,000 over 3 years has been budgeted for IT enhancements to support new regulatory programs, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the photo of the Leader of the Opposition standing behind a poster that reads, "Keep the oil in the ground." Will he apologize to the 34,000 people who are employed by the oil and gas?
Next. Next question. I remind the members of the use of props. Thanks. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a disappointing response from a minister who knows very well that this isn't about replacing all of that infrastructure tomorrow. It's about having a plan. Having a plan to ensure pipelines are replaced in a timely, evidence-based way, having a plan to get people back to work. And Mr. Speaker, these members seem to have forgotten very quickly the pipeline spill, the Husky spill, that cost that company so many dollars, that costs our province so many dollars, the polluted water in this province, Mr. Speaker. This is about protecting land, protecting water, and getting people back to work. This is an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to create jobs here in Saskatchewan, which is what this government should be focused on. Instead of flying all around, working for Andrew Scheer and Doug Ford, we stand by this idea, Mr. Speaker. This is a wise approach, but if they don't want to follow our lead, where are their ideas? Where are their plans? Because right now, Mr. Speaker, people are hurting. Our economy is struggling, and this government is offering nothing but noise, Mr. Speaker. If the government won't take this on, will they stand up and tell us what concrete measures they're taking right now to get people back to work?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2016 Husky spill, Mr. Speaker, isn't believed to have been caused by aging pipelines. It was caused by geotechnical sloping, Mr. Speaker. That scheme is untried and untested. Those are the Leader of the Opposition's own words for replacing aging pipelines, Mr. Speaker. Where would that scheme leave farmers who'd have to dig up their fields every 10 years? Where would it leave sector producers who are just starting to get back on their feet, Mr. Speaker? Don't let that Leader of the Opposition anywhere near the energy sector. He would drive it into the ground.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Day after day, Mr. Speaker, we see a dismissive approach from the Health Minister. This is also the approach taken by many of his cabinet colleagues, especially when questioned about their privatization agenda across ministries. Mr. Speaker, in December 2013, the provincial government announced that it was closing Saskatchewan's 5 publicly owned hospital laundry facilities and contracting with Alberta-based K-Bro Linen Services to process the linens at a new private laundry facility. Since this decision was made, we have received numerous complaints about issues with this privatized service and stories about receiving soiled, dirty, and unsafe laundry at our public health facilities. How many incident reports of soiled or dangerous linen has the minister received since the Sask Party government privatized our provincial linen and laundry services?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't have the number with me. I'll certainly make it available to the member. Mr. Speaker, the linen has been a success. It's showed cost savings. It's very efficient, Mr. Speaker. I know the member likes to point out anomalies that happen and make it seem like it's widespread through the system, but Mr. Speaker, those sorts of incidents happened previous to K-Bro as well, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to continue to look for ways to be more efficient in the healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, and certainly the laundry one has been a success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Mr. Speaker, we know from talking with healthcare employees that these laundry issues are persistent. That's why it was disturbing when our office received a copy of an internal 3S Health Safer Practice Alert Notice about an incident at a long-term care home in Melville. On October 24th of last year, a handmade knife, a shank, Mr. Speaker, was found in clean laundry intended for use at a senior's home. The weapon was found inside of a recently cleaned sheet. Does the minister find it acceptable that an improvised weapon was discovered in sheets intended for a resident of a long-term care home? And again, how many incidents have been reported since this government privatized laundry in 2013?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in the first answer, I don't have the number with me. I'll certainly get the number and make it available to the member opposite. Mr. Speaker, incidents like that are not acceptable. They certainly are not. Those incidents are looked into. Every effort's made to rectify them. Mr. Speaker, I should point out, though, as I did in the first answer, that before the change in the laundry system to K-Bro, Mr. Speaker, incidents like that unfortunately occurred at that time as well. Mr. Speaker, those sorts of things need to be rectified. Processes are put in place to minimize them, but Mr. Speaker, this doesn't speak to the overall change to the laundry system, which again has been successful, has been savings realized, and Mr. Speaker, has worked very well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, sadly, we are seeing some of the consequences that come with the Sask Party government's privatization and centralization agenda. In speech from the throne, the government announced it's planning to look at centralized purchasing for all government services. And that could be a good thing, because saving money for taxpayers is always a good thing, Mr. Speaker. But when we look at this government's record of trying to centralize and save money, it hasn't been a story with very much success, whether it's a $2 billion bypass with overpasses that can't accommodate farm equipment, P3 schools that don't meet the demands of our students and teachers, or even weapons found in laundry intended for residents in long-term care homes. So, as this government looks to centralize purchasing for government goods and services, what are they doing to make sure there aren't any more unintended consequences for Saskatchewan people? What's the plan?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, a number of years ago through Priority Saskatchewan, we announced that we were going to go through a procurement transformation plan, Mr. Speaker. And one of the 13 points, Mr. Speaker, that we discussed those a number of years ago, Mr. Speaker, was single window procurement, Mr. Speaker, where all government procurement would happen at one place, Mr. Speaker. To standardize RFPs across the piece, Mr. Speaker, to bring executive government procurement into one place, Mr. Speaker, which we believe is going to save significant millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, funds that we can use, Mr. Speaker, for delivery of more health care services, for more education, Mr. Speaker. But single window procurement, Mr. Speaker, has been, when we go and talk to industry, Mr. Speaker, we go talk to businesses, Mr. Speaker, they're excited about the work we're doing under procurement, Mr. Speaker, to modernize procurement. There's many provinces across the country, Mr. Speaker, who have come to us and looked to see what we've done over our procurement transformation plan over these last number of years. Mr. Speaker, it's been successful. It's going to continue to be successful, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to work on making sure that we're more efficient and more effective when it comes to procurement.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, we're just wondering if that procurement plan will include Saskatchewan companies and people working here in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, CP Rail got 300 acres of GTH land from this government for free, even though they only needed less than 30. Now, this is land that the government spent public dollars to expropriate for public purposes from farmers, and then they handed it over to CP for private purposes. And when it comes to the Loblaws land, the Minister for the GTH is in a bit of a bind. Now, I'm sure he'd love to tell us whether Loblaws got the land for free, but he says he can't, because they signed a non-disclosure agreement. Well, there's an easy fix for this problem, Mr. Speaker. Call a judicial inquiry into what went down at the GTH, and those records would come out under subpoena. And that's what he should do, but he refuses. So why did the Sask Party agree to a non-disclosure agreement for a land deal paid for with public dollars and expropriated for public purposes? And whose idea was it to ask for a non-disclosure agreement anyways?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Simple answer to the question was Loblaws asked for it, Mr. Speaker. Most of the other people that are clients there have not chosen to ask for it. It's not there. If somebody asks for it, it's a commercially reasonable thing to ask for. Depends on the nature of their business, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you this. Today is the 15th year anniversary since I was elected. So I've been an MLA for 15 years. And Mr. Speaker, the members opposite, they ask, travel, don't travel. Carbon tax, no carbon tax. Drill, don't drill. Leave it in the ground, take it out of the ground. Pipelines, no pipelines. Mr. Speaker, they are all over the map. Mr. Speaker, I can tell this to the Leader of the Opposition. He's going to go the same way as Lingenfelder and Broughton. I can see a hat trick coming up.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon, Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, with answers like that, perhaps the minister might, maybe he should stick to selling turkeys. Mr. Speaker, there's a troubling pattern here when it comes to the deals this government makes when it sells or gives away public assets. People have questions, but there aren't any answers from this government. How much did Loblaws pay for their land? We may never know because there's a confidentiality agreement in place. How much did the Sask Party get for the sale of assets for our provincial bus company, the STC? Again, we don't know because of a confidentiality agreement. The Percher, this is about transparency. How can the Sask Party justify signing these confidentiality agreements that block public scrutiny when they're managing public dollars belonging to the people of Saskatchewan? Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite asked about what the situation was with regard to CP Rail. I will undertake to find that out and provide whatever information I can find out, whatever information is available, and will certainly want to provide whatever information is within the public domain. Mr. Speaker, I can say this about that. CP Rail goes in and out of there with a number of trains every day. 60,000 containers per year are moved through that facility. Mr. Speaker, the GTH works closely with all of the clients that are there to try and ensure that things are brought them. Those 60,000 containers bring automobiles, food, electronics, a variety of other goods and services into and out of the city of Regina and into and out of the province of Saskatchewan. We look forward to that process continuing. We look forward to it expanding. Mr. Speaker, some of the members opposite went on a tour of the GTH last session. And Mr. Speaker, I would make the same offer to them about the CP facility, and they can go and have a look and see how the containers are moved, what the process is. The members opposite, I hear chirping from their seat. I'd encourage them to go and have a look.
Hear, hear, hear. Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, we asked the minister some simple questions about student enrollment last week, and we got anything but clear answers. When we asked about when the enrollment numbers would be available and whether this government would be providing mid-year funding to school division to help ease the pressures in the classrooms, the minister talked about 2007, and he went on about the carbon tax, and he tried to suggest that students have an extra $3 million to support them in the classroom. Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister might want to get himself into a classroom and try that Sask Party math on teachers. $3 million is not the $70 million that this government has cut from classrooms over the last 2 years, and that minister knows it. Again, to the minister, will he commit today to a mid-year funding top-up to ease the pressures that our classrooms are experiencing today?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my answer last week was very clear. When we table our budget in the spring, Mr. Speaker, the numbers in the budget reflect the projected enrollments that are given to us by the school divisions for the fall, Mr. Speaker. So in the spring, we get a number of the projected enrollment for September, Mr. Speaker, and those are the numbers that we use when we distribute funds in the formula, Mr. Speaker, to the school divisions. So in reality, Mr. Speaker, the only time you require a mid-year adjustment is if those numbers were significantly skewed. Mr. Speaker, they were unrepresented by a number of, Mr. Speaker, this year, and as a result, the amount of money that went into the formula, Mr. Speaker, gets to be redistributed, Mr. Speaker. It's about $3 million, I think, if I recall my answer last week, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, here's the reality. Enrollment in Saskatoon and Saskatchewan schools is up about 13%. Since 2007. And over that same period of time, funding to public education from this government, Mr. Speaker, is up almost 33%. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to have conversations, Mr. Speaker, with teachers and with school divisions and with our partners in education as we start to build our budget for next spring, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the minister is very fond of saying that he's having conversations out in classrooms around the province, Mr. Speaker, but it does beg the question if the minister is now actually going to listen to the desperation and the pressures that are being experienced in the classroom, what the point of all these discussions are. Mr. Speaker, I know that he's been out in the classrooms and he's hearing the same things that I am, and this is what I'm hearing. The teachers are trying harder and harder to make do with fewer and fewer supports, and that kids are falling through the cracks in every corner of this province. It is not an exaggeration, Mr. Speaker, to call what is happening in our classrooms a crisis. A government that tries to balance the books on the backs of our kids, as this one has done year over year, is a sign of a government that has truly lost its way. Will the minister and that premier keep their promise to teachers, to parents, and to students, and commit to not only providing a mid-year funding boost, but to fully restoring the $70 million that his government has cut from classrooms over the last 2 years?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker, we've gone through this before, Mr. Speaker. The funding that comes from the Ministry of Education, from the Government of Saskatchewan, in the spring is reflective of the enrollment projections that are given to us by the school divisions, Mr. Speaker, and generally they're pretty accurate, Mr. Speaker. But in this last year's budget, Mr. Speaker, an additional $30 million into the budget as a result of the commitment that the Premier made, Mr. Speaker, that's in the budget. We're out having the same conversations. I agree. We're out having conversations with teachers, with school divisions, Mr. Speaker, with parents, and all that information, Mr. Speaker, I get to take back, Mr. Speaker, as we start to build the budget for the next year, Mr. Speaker. And we're hearing some concerns, Mr. Speaker, in classrooms. We're hearing from teachers. But we're having these conversations, Mr. Speaker, and how best to reflect those concerns, Mr. Speaker, except bring them back, having a conversation on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, as we start to build our budget for the springtime, Mr. Speaker. But I'll repeat. 12% increase in enrollment since 2007 with a corresponding 33% increase in funding, Mr. Speaker. That shows this government's commitment to funding public education in Saskatchewan.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Morgan.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
No, thank you. Yep. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 141, the Interpersonal Violence Disclosure Protocol, Clare's Law Act, be now introduced and read a first time.
Hear, hear. It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 141 be now introduced and read a first time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? Recognize the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next sitting.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committee. Orders of the day.
Written question. Question number 1 asked by Ms. Bennett.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the questions to the answers to questions 1 through 3.
Tabled 1 through 3.
Government orders, second readings, item number 9, bill number 140, the Animal Health Act. The Honourable Mr. Merritt.
that it? Recognize the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the end of my remarks, I will move second reading of the Animal Health Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, the Animal Health Act repeals and replaces the Diseases of Animals Act, which has seen only minor revisions since it was enacted in 1966. In fact, the Diseases of Animals Act is the second oldest piece of animal health legislation in Canada. It was sufficient for its time, but that time has passed. For example, fines for contravening the legislation are capped at $500, a significant amount then, but hardly more than a large speeding ticket today. As another example, the Act gives the Minister of Agriculture very broad powers to take any measures to suppress or control a disease outbreak. However, this requires a minister's order to determine that a disease requires a response. This is time-consuming and has the potential to prevent provincial authorities from taking quick action if the situation demands it. Authority and responsibility are also not clearly defined in the current Act, which means it could potentially fail to withstand a legal challenge should one be brought against the province. Therefore, for the benefit of the province's livestock sector and the province's livestock, we are proposing new legislation, the Animal Health Act. The new Act contains the following provisions. It assigns the authority to prevent, control, and respond to animal disease outbreaks to the province's Chief Veterinary Officer rather than the Minister of Agriculture. This will allow the province to act quickly when necessary and aligns with legislation in most other provinces. It also gives the Chief Veterinary Officer, rather than the Minister of Agriculture, the authority to add or remove a disease from the list of provincially notifiable diseases. This is another efficiency measure. If a new and dangerous disease appears in Saskatchewan, it is important that the province is able to respond quickly and not be slowed down by the requirements of a minister's order. The new Act expands the definition of disease to include non-infectious threats to animal health, such as toxins, for example, lead or ergot. The new Act will also deal with emerging issues such as antimicrobial resistance. The new Act clearly sets out the veterinary inspector's authorities and responsibilities with regard to entering and inspecting premises, especially establishing quarantines, disease surveillance and control zones, and euthanizing animals to prevent suffering or the spread of disease. This greatly reduces the threat of legal challenges. It updates the penalties to make them a more effective deterrent. Fines will be increased from $500 to a maximum of $25,000, with provision for daily fines for ongoing offences. For really serious offences, the term of imprisonment has increased from 6 months to 1 year. These penalties are in line with those in other provinces. Finally, the new Act expands the scope of regulations that may be made under its authority to include a broad range of potential regulatory issues. Some examples would be control of animal diseases, oversight of stray animals, premise identification, and traceability. As well, this section will give the Minister of Agriculture potential authority to regulate the dispensing of veterinary drugs in Saskatchewan, which could prove useful in the future if there are unintended consequences to current federal regulatory changes. The government has consulted extensively on this new legislation. We spoke to producers through their producer associations, as well as the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, the Agriculture Producers Association of Saskatchewan. We received input from the Ministries of Environment and Health, from the federal government, the relevant colleges at the University of Saskatchewan, veterinarians, and the providers of veterinary services. In general, there is a broad support for the new legislation, although there were a few concerns regarding definitions, inspections, and delegated authority that have been clarified in the legislation or will be addressed in the regulations. In summary, Mr. Speaker, the Animal Health Act 2018 is a much-needed update to the province's 50-year-old animal health legislation. It addresses issues that did not exist when the old legislation was passed in 1966. It more clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of the Minister of Agriculture, veterinary inspectors, and the public, reducing confusion and increasing the efficiency with which we respond to threats to animal health. It is simply a good piece of legislation that will bring Saskatchewan's animal health laws into the 21st century and position us for more growth in the years ahead. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I move the Animal Health Act 2018 be read a second time. Thank you.
It's been moved by the Minister that Animal Health Act be read a second time. Pleasure of the Assembly. I recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to join in on the debate and just to make some comments initially on Bill 140, the Animal Health Act 2018. As the Minister made response to the second speech he referred to, I just want to kind of go over some of the information he shared, and obviously he's saying in 1966 the Act is replacing one, this new Act will come into effect and replacing an Act that came into effect in 1966. And he talked about some different changes. He referred to in there about different powers that would be given to the Minister or to, I guess, an agency that could act upon the provincial veterinarians with no. But he referred to it, I guess, of duties, and he said there was some areas where they were doing some clarification, and it's good to hear him share that information and that they're working on it, that they consulted with many, that he just didn't go on, and I understand that that's part of the process. And from what I've got from some of the comments the Minister referred to, he has gone out and he's saying he's consulted with the federal government, many in the province, whether it was agriculture, industry, veterinarians, the private sector, I guess, university, I hope. So he referred to a list of some of the areas and some of those individuals that he's consulted, and they're trying to move in a positive way, as what I got from his comments. But again, like everything else, we have to go through our process, and I know my colleagues, myself, will have some initial comments here and asking. At the end of the day, we want legislation. It's the role of the government to bring in new legislation and improve things for Saskatchewan residents, and we hope that he's consulted widely, as he said, that they've made sure. But I guess it gives us an opportunity, if there is anyone that we want to check with, and our critic for agriculture wants to do that as well. They talk about certain powers that the Minister, right now they would have to get permission by the Minister to do certain things. He's now, by regulations, by changing, amending the legislation, there'll be certain powers that'll be given away, or certain powers those will have to, and my understanding I got to react quicker in a crisis or an emergency situation, where it gives those powers to individuals who will act on the best of the province and making sure when it comes to the health of livestock, animals, and making sure. He talked about there, I guess, bringing up some of the fines from $500 to $25,000 as far. He talked about jail sentences going from 6 months to a year. So it's more, I guess, serious offense or serious calling on someone to clean up or respond. So I don't have a lot of more comments on this. I appreciate the Minister sharing his views on this bill, and we will go through the process. I know my colleagues will ask more questions, and we'll do the work that we need to do to make sure legislation is right, and hopefully this is the best part of it. So at this point, I have no more further comments on Bill 140. I'm prepared to adjourn debate.
Member has moved adjournment. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 3. The Honourable Mr. Kading to move second reading Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Rise today to move second reading of Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Act 2018. The Local Government Election Act 2015, or the LGEA, governs all local elections throughout the province. This includes elections for mayor, reeve, and councillors in all types of municipalities, cities, towns, villages, rural municipalities, and northern municipalities. It also governs school board elections, which are usually conducted by municipalities on behalf of school divisions. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is important in ensuring the smooth, efficient, and transparent running of elections for municipalities and school boards across our province. And Mr. Speaker, it's important that government amend this legislation in between the four-year general local election cycle to give sufficient lead time for local election officials to prepare for the changes well in advance of election day. The last general local elections were in fall 2016, and the next will occur in fall 2020. A key change proposed within these amendments is to move the general local election date from the fourth Wednesday in October 2020 to Monday, November 9th, 2020. This will address the overlap of the provincial and local election periods in 2020. The provincial election date will also be moved and will be held on October 26, 2020. As a result, the provincial election will be a full 2 weeks before the local elections. Government Relations thanks municipal and education sector stakeholders for their patience and thoughtful consideration over the past few months of various options to address the proximity of local and provincial election dates. After 2020, Mr. Speaker, the amendments provided for the local election date to be held on the second Wednesday of November. This keeps a long-standing practice of holding local elections on a Wednesday. The amendments further provide that if that day, the second Wednesday of November, falls on Remembrance Day, the local election date will be the Monday of that week. The amendments also provide for rural municipality staggered elections to also be moved to November to match the same date and day of week as the general local elections. Mr. Speaker, again, we think the changes to be administratively workable. They do not require extending the four-year terms of office for local officials or require changes to the summer election date for resort villages or northern municipal election date options. Now, Mr. Speaker, the other amendments proposed in this bill primarily do four main things. First, they provide consistency and added flexibility regarding advanced voting opportunities for voters. Second, they require candidates to submit a disclosure statement as part of filing nomination papers to identify potential conflicts of interest in advance. Third, they address a number of stakeholder suggestions for improvements and clarifications to election processes and practices that the Ministry has received over almost 2 years of consultations with both municipal and education sector associations. And finally, they consolidate the controverted Municipal Elections Act into the LGEA, updating these provisions in the process and providing a single source of reference for election officials and the public going forward. I will touch on each one of these areas of amendments briefly. Mr. Speaker, the current legislation requires advanced polls for cities, towns and villages, while in rural municipalities and resort villages, advanced polls are optional. We believe all voters should be able to vote in advance of Election Day if they're not available on Election Day or if it is more convenient to do so. Therefore, starting with the 2020 general elections, all municipalities will be required to provide advanced voting opportunity for voters, either by mail-in ballot or advanced poll. The amendments also add flexibility to make it easier for municipalities to hold an advanced poll. This includes the ability to establish an advanced poll for limited hours and establish an advanced poll on any day of the week. Mr. Speaker, public disclosure statements have been required to be filed by legislation for all elected officials since 2015. The Ministry heard concerns that some sitting council members have not filed these statements. Public disclosure statements are important in ensuring council member accountability, transparency, and integrity. Proposed amendments will require candidates to submit a public disclosure statement to identify potential conflicts of interest as part of filing nomination papers. This will ensure that the public disclosure statement is in place when the council member takes office. Mr. Speaker, a number of amendments in this bill address stakeholder suggestions to improve and clarify the legislation. I'd like to share a few examples. The Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities requested greater flexibility to use other means, such as the municipal website and social media, to notify the public of the call for nominations and other election matters where publication in a local newspaper is not possible or is insufficient. The Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association requested an amendment to clarify that volunteer firefighters are eligible to run for office and are not considered municipal employees and hence disqualified from running for office. The Provincial Association of Resort Communities of Saskatchewan requested changes to ensure that campsite tenants are not eligible to run or vote in the municipality where the campsite is located by virtue of leasing the campsite only. And the Saskatchewan School Boards Association requested discretionary authority for school boards to require candidates to provide a criminal record check with their nomination papers, similar to the existing authority for municipalities. Each of these requests have been addressed in this bill, and we thank these organizations for suggesting these improvements. Finally, Mr. Speaker, amendments in this bill will incorporate the provisions of the Controverted Municipal Elections Act into the LGA, providing for all election provisions to be housed in a single act going forward. The Controverted Municipal Elections Act provides authority for a voter to challenge a municipal election in instances where a candidate, candidate's agent, or any person may have offered a bribe, issued threats, or encouraged a non-voter to vote. Stakeholders agree that consolidating these provisions into the LGA will be more convenient and efficient for candidates, election officials, and the public. It also allows these provisions to be updated, since the wording in the Controverted Municipal Elections Act is quite out of date. For example, that Act currently references the use of horses, carriages, or teams to convey a voter to the polls, by candidates as being deemed guilty of bribery. So incorporating these provisions into the LGA also allows for revisions to address gender neutrality and reflect the proper procedure in today's court system for contesting an election. Other provinces, including Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, have controverted election provisions within their local government election legislation. Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I want to comment on the consultations over the past 2 years with the municipal and education sector associations on this bill. Initial consultations began with a survey of all municipalities conducted shortly after the October 2016 general local elections. They continued in 2017 with municipal and education sector associations on the more substantive changes being proposed and suggested to improve election matters, and in 2018 with consultations on changing local election date. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the sector associations who took the time to provide input, advice, and feedback in the development of this legislation. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I believe this bill shows government's continued commitment to ensuring the smooth, efficient, and transparent running of local elections for municipalities and school boards across our province. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 134, the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018.
Hear, hear. It has been moved that Bill number 134 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon to join in on this debate, or begin this debate from our side around this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. I appreciated the minister's comments, especially the 2 times he referenced that he's pleased that this will provide smooth, efficient, and transparent elections, which is quite humorous to hear, considering, I would say, they've been anything but smooth, transparent, and efficient in many areas, especially when we're talking about the elections in this province, Mr. Speaker. I did want to point out one thing, and I was trying to find the tweet that I saw last week when this bill was initially introduced in the legislature. The Sask Party tweet that came out that day said, "New election date, October 26, 2020. And it's just an aside, but I think it's pulled down now, and I'm happy to see that, because we're not even close to being at the place where that legislation has passed and the new election date is in fact October 26, 2020. It's more of just a point, but we're just moving right into the adjourned debates here, Mr. Speaker. Let's at least pretend that these adjourned debates are important, and hopefully will influence this legislation in a more positive light, Mr. Speaker. I also wanted to point out the minister's comment that this legislative change will allow for a full 2 weeks between the provincial and the civic elections, Mr. Speaker. Mission accomplished. 2 weeks in between these two important elections, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that 2 weeks is sufficient enough time for those 2 elections to be held. I don't know why 2 weeks is better than 1 week. I guess it's technically a little bit better, but it's nowhere near satisfactory to the stakeholders that we're hearing from, the mayors who are concerned about this, the city councillors that we're hearing about this, the school board trustees that we're hearing from this. They're very worried about what this is going to mean in terms of voter attention, voter apathy. Mr. Speaker, there's a provincial election. 2 weeks later, there's going to be a municipal election. Mr. Speaker, in between that, there's going to be an American election, Mr. Speaker. So this is really concerning. There's a lot of people who are really concerned about this, who want to raise their points of consideration, Mr. Speaker. I do want to point out that the minister's spoken a bit about improving the allowance for some advanced, allowing for more flexibility in advanced voting.
Let a smile be your umbrella.
That's an important thing. We need to do what we can to modernize our elections, Mr. Speaker, to encourage more people to vote, to make sure that more people in our province are able to vote and are voting, Mr. Speaker. Advanced polls are a really large piece of that. We're finding more and more people are choosing to vote in the advanced polling prior to the election day. I think that's positive, as long as that's allowing for more people to be able to vote. But that's why it's concerning that there's only 2 weeks between these two elections, Mr. Speaker. We want as many people to vote as possible, and our goal in this House should be to make sure that as many people who can vote do vote, and that as many people in this province are actually able and qualified to vote, Mr. Speaker. So when we're talking about election dates for two very important sets of elections that will be happening 2 weeks apart, Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of concerns. We're going to be continuing to do the work to talk to stakeholders, find out what their concerns are. I understand there's a lot of pieces in this bill that I think require very important consideration, and we'll do that analysis work. Mr. Speaker, I know our critic will do very good work in doing that. So with that, I'd like to adjourn debate on Bill number 134.
Hear, hear.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 4, second reading of Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendments Act 2018. The Honourable Mr. Kading.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendment Act 2018. This bill makes an amendment to one bilingual act, the Education Act 1995, as a result of the introduction of the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018. Mr. Speaker, the proposed amendment responds to a request from the Saskatchewan School Boards Association by providing authority for school boards to require a candidate to submit a criminal record check as part of the nomination process. A corresponding amendment in the Local Government Election Amendment Act 2018 requires that a criminal record check be included with the nomination papers if the school board has passed such a resolution under the Education Act 1995. Similar authority currently exists for municipalities in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. The presence of record does not disqualify a person from running for office. This remains a decision of the voters. The amendment provides for transparency during the election campaign, and it is a decision of a school board to require a record check as part of the nomination papers. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 135, the Local Government Election Consequential Amendment Act 2018.
It has been moved that Bill number 135 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon to enter into begin the debate on this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the official opposition. Happy to see that the Minister and the Sask Party are finally listening to requests from the SSBA, Mr. Speaker. So I thought it'd be pertinent to pass along some other requests that the SSBA have had for a while that seem to be ignored by the Sask Party. Since they're listening right now to this specific request, let's hear some more. SSBA has been calling for immediate and predictable funding and transparent and adequate funding for their school boards that they represent, Mr. Speaker. They haven't been getting that. They haven't been getting it for the last few years. We saw the budget cut to education. 2 years ago, we saw only about a third of that being reinstated back from the Sask Party, and they are doing nothing but applauding themselves for giving $15 back when they've taken $20 from schools, as an example, Mr. Speaker. They also asked if Bill 63 could be scrapped, Mr. Speaker, and what did the Sask Party do? They passed it. And they gave themselves more power and less power to these locally elected school boards that now they're saying that they listen to, Mr. Speaker. I know there'll be a lot more work that we're going to be doing with respect to this legislation. We're going to continue to consult. I know our critics are going to do very good work in that regard, and I'm going to allow them to, I want to facilitate them in doing that work. So with that, I'll adjourn debate on this bill. Thank you.
Member has adjourned debate on Bill number 135. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders. Adjourned second readings. Item number 7. Resume debate, or I'm sorry. The Honourable Mr. Kading to move second reading Bill number 138.
Recognize the Minister of Government Relations.
Got a lot of work done.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to move second reading of Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018. This bill, if passed, will amend 8 public and technical safety statutes for which the Ministry of Government Relations is responsible, and that protect public safety by ensuring the safe operation of buildings and equipment across our province. 4 of the acts amended by this bill are administered by Government Relations: the Electrical Licensing Act, the Gas Licensing Act, the Fire Safety Act, and the Uniform Building and Accessibility Standards Act. The other 4 acts amended by this bill relate to the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan, known as TSASC, and its role in administering Saskatchewan's safety program for boilers and pressure vessel equipment, elevating devices, and amusement rides in the province. These acts are the Boiler Pressure Vessel Act 1999, the Passenger and Freight Elevator Act, the Amusement Ride Safety Act, and the Technical Safety Authority of Saskatchewan Act. Mr. Speaker, all of these acts share the same goal of protecting public safety, but the enforcement measures they contain are limited, sometimes impractical, and different from one act to the next. This limits the ability of the Ministry and TSAS to deal with non-compliance and contraventions of the codes and standards in the acts they are responsible for enforcing. Mr. Speaker, before I talk about what this bill does, I want to say that the vast majority of the companies, contractors, and tradespeople covered under these acts are responsible and compliant with the codes and standards set out in the acts. This bill is focused on the small minority that are non-compliant, whether by oversight or lack of training or through deliberate and calculated decisions to cut corners or costs. Mr. Speaker, this bill does 2 main things to deal with the realities of non-compliance. First, it will make the existing enforcement measures consistent across all statutes I mentioned in terms of authority, wording, penalty amounts, and procedures. Second, it will add more effective enforcement measures in place in other Saskatchewan legislation, such as administrative penalties, discipline orders, and public notices. These measures will allow for a more flexible and responsive approach in dealing with non-compliance and safety issues. They will also potentially lessen the time and cost to resolve situations for government, TSASC, as well as offenders, and be more effective in dealing with companies that move in and out of the province. At the same time, the amendments proposed in this bill will provide that these measures are balanced with procedural fairness and the rights of representation and appeal. I will briefly expand on how this bill achieves these objectives. 1. Consistent enforcement measures across the statutes. Mr. Speaker, some of these existing enforcement measures in these statutes, such as compliance orders, are not consistently authorized or provided for across the acts. For example, the Passenger and Freight Elevator Act lacks the authority for the Chief Inspector to issue compliance orders, and only 2 of the other acts allow government to apply to the court to enforce a compliance order. This bill makes these authorities consistent across the acts. In addition, some of the acts have very outdated penalties for offences, as low as $300 for elevator infractions. Court-ordered fines and penalties need to be made consistent and increased to be taken seriously and to be a deterrent to non-compliance. This bill will increase the maximum fines to $25,000 for an individual and $200,000 for a corporation, which is more consistent with other legislation in the province. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the codes, standards and other requirements in public safety legislation are upheld for the safety of our people as they directly or indirectly use public buildings, spaces and equipment in their daily lives, including activities such as riding in elevators, working and studying in offices and schools, and taking children on amusement rides. If penalties are not high enough, there is little to deter one from correcting a contravention and choosing to be non-compliant. A person or organization may risk the chance of conviction because it is cheaper than paying the extra costs to come into compliance. High penalties are deterrent for those who care little for public safety. Mr. Speaker, I would like to make it clear that with this bill, the focus is more on compliance and safety than it is on punishment. And this leads me to the second main area of amendments in this bill. 2, additional tools to deal effectively with non-compliance. The second main area of amendments involves adding more effective and responsive enforcement measures, such as administrative penalties and discipline orders, to the tools that the Chief Inspector, the Fire Commissioner, or Chief Building Official has to ensure compliance. And I want to note the authority to use these additional and alternative measure is extended only to these chief officials. Administrative penalties and discipline orders allow the chief officials within the ministry or TSASC to apply fines or require corrective actions such as additional training or reporting to address contraventions and non-compliance issues. These measures would be instead of pursuing legal prosecution, cancelling a license, or shutting down the operation of a building or equipment, which may not always be practically possible or in the best interests of the public. This provides a more consensual and collaborative option to resolve non-compliance issues between the regulator, be it TSASC or the ministry, and an individual business at the outset of an issue, before it escalates to a license suspension, shutting down equipment, or legal action. These provisions, modelled after comparable legislation to other Saskatchewan acts and across Canada, provide more timely and more responsive alternatives to dealing with non-compliance. They're not as expensive or heavy-handed for government or industry as pursuing legal prosecution, which is rarely used except in extreme circumstances. And Mr. Speaker, I can assure you there are a number of checks and balances in the provisions to ensure fairness and transparency is followed. For example, with the authority of the chief official to issue a fine or penalty comes requirements to give written prior notice of the penalty, the reasons for it, and to hear representation from the person being issued the fine or penalty before it is issued. This reflects recommendations of the Saskatchewan Law Reform Commission regarding the use of administrative penalties to ensure fair processes are followed and that the opportunity for an offender to be heard is given. In addition, the existing appeal boards and processes in the Acts will continue, as will the ability for an affected company or individual to ultimately appeal a matter to the courts. Further policies and guidelines around penalties and orders will be developed by the Ministry and TSASC. Mr. Speaker, these tools will allow a chief official to be more flexible in dealing with a contravention or non-compliance situation and better match enforcement to the circumstances of the infraction. For example, a one-time or ongoing fine for an expired license and unauthorized work is easier to implement and a better deterrent than pursuing prosecution. And sometimes it is not practical, and there is greater risk to public safety in shutting down equipment for infractions that are unrelated to the equipment, such as signage, fencing, or staffing requirements. In these situations, more training, reporting, and monitoring may be more appropriate. The measures in this bill provide for these alternatives to target the source of non-compliance and swiftly address the issue with the license holder or equipment owner. And again, as I had indicated earlier, in these circumstances, these measures come with prior notice and the opportunity to make representation from the person being issued the penalty before it is issued. As an added deterrent to non-compliance for repeat offenders, this bill provides the Minister the authority to publish a notice of an order a revocation, or suspension of a license in any manner necessary to inform and protect the public that an offender is in contravention or non-compliance. Mr. Speaker, before I conclude my remarks, I want to note that the broad consultations were undertaken on the measures proposed in this bill. Since we're dealing with a diverse audience, the best means for reaching the maximum amount of viewers was to post the proposed changes on the Saskatchewan.ca website, public consultation page. We believe we were successful in reaching as many potentially affected stakeholders as possible by using this method and by directly contacting stakeholder and industry associations. Most of the responses received understood the need for the measures proposed or expressed support for the amendments, particularly municipal stakeholders. Again, we think the challenges balance the need for additional enforcement measures with the rights of prior notice, representation, and appeal. In closing, I believe these amendments are important both for industry and for government to better protect public safety and the safe operation of buildings and equipment across our province. And so, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 138, the Miscellaneous Statutes, Government Relations Enforcement Measures Amendment Act 2018.
Here. It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 138 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will not be denied in this debate. I will not be denied. They can call him the chief building official all they like, but or the minister could go on at length, but we'll do as he did, long and loud. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, this is it's not quite housekeeping, but it certainly governs various of the principles by which you would build a house, or perhaps a roller coaster, or a boiler, Mr. Speaker. And all joking aside, Mr. Speaker, there are some very serious matters under consideration here today. I know in back and forth across the floor with the member from Weyburn, Big Muddy, we're reflecting on, like it's all fun and games until you go flying off the tilt-a-whirl. And when that happens, Mr. Speaker, you certainly want to know who set it up, what were the terms by which they're setting up the amusement park ride, Mr. Speaker, and what are the penalties involved should something go wrong. You want to have some assurance around the quality control. And again, Mr. Speaker, all joking aside, there are some very serious matters under consideration here in the legislation, and certainly this is about as fundamental in terms of long-standing in terms of the work that government does around regulation and provision of safe buildings, safe bridges, safe amusement parks, you name it, Mr. Speaker. So safe elevators. I guess the thing about this particular piece of legislation, and I guess if I could, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to provide a bit of context for the legislation coming forward at this time, in terms of as was mentioned just earlier this day, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the way that this government is perhaps growing long in the tooth, Mr. Speaker, and the way that has been around for a while, and maybe it gets a little, I don't know, the legislative agenda tends to lend itself to a lot of housekeeping. The number of measures in this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, where the clause involves, making sure that department is changed to ministry, and then that is clearly understood, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's that's housekeeping, and it's got to be done. You got to do it every decade or so, keep up with the times. And of course, this comes a decade after they changed the nomenclature from department to ministry. So, I don't know when they're going to run out of this particular measure in their legislative toolkit, Mr. Speaker, but maybe TSASC or the Uniform Building Code can keep us up on these matters as sort of, what's being used in the legislative toolkit by this government. But again, Mr. Speaker, it's not exactly the rocket ride of some of the other bills on the docket here today, but does cover some very important matters in our society. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, you want to make sure that you've got very clear penalties in place in terms of when these things do go wrong. You want to know when things do go wrong, what's the appropriate process, what are the penalties that are in place. We'll be interested to know how these penalties stack up to other jurisdictions, and if this is, you know, where we stand across the other jurisdictions. We'll also want to know, Mr. Speaker, you know, looking at this, I think of my dear old dad and the Gas Licensing Act. My father was the 35-year gas fitter for Sask Power Gas Division and then Sask Energy. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, if you know, the consequence for somebody not doing their job could result in an explosion that in turn could result in the loss of property and in some cases the loss of life. And as sort of mundane and as normal as the course of work was day to day, that was always in the mix, Mr. Speaker. So we do look to regulation, we do look to legislation to make sure that those kind of concerns are nailed down so that people's expectation of government being a guarantor and an enforcer of public safety, that they're doing that job as forcefully and effectively as can be done, Mr. Speaker. So again, all of these things, it's fairly, you know, be it fire safety, be it the Passenger and Freight Elevator Act, Mr. Speaker, TSASC, as the Minister is pointing out, there are some very important functions that go to the fundamental work of government and indeed long-standing work, Mr. Speaker. And I'd venture to say that different of these activities on the part of government have been around the statutes of Saskatchewan probably since before Saskatchewan came into being. A lot of this stuff would date back to the Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps not the Amusement Park Act, perhaps not, but certainly various of these other activities are of long standing. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, it's a mixed bag. There's some important work being done here. There's some, you know, let's take the pile and then, you know, shovel the pile and move it over here, and then a decade later we'll move the pile back over here in terms of the changing from department to ministry and, you know, the critical action that's on display in this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, to bring that nomenclature up to date, having changed it themselves, Mr. Speaker. And again, what that indicates about the overall sort of legislative agenda on the part of this government. But, you know, so be it, so it goes. With that, Mr. Speaker, I know that other of my colleagues will be watching this one with great interest. Certainly, I think listening, not too closely, because that could be kind of dangerous in and of itself. But again, the work that is represented in here, a lot of men and women doing great work to provide for safe, reliable, be it elevators or boilers or you name it, Mr. Speaker. The building code, there's a lot of important work that is represented here, and that you know, absolutely should be bolstered and be assured that the legislation governing it is kept up to date. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I know that other of my colleagues will have more to say on these matters. Much of it, I'm sure, more interesting and insightful than the comments I've put on the record at this time. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 138, an act to amend certain acts respecting enforcement measures.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 138. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. The Honourable Mr. Duncan to move second reading of Bill number 132, the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Amendment Act 2018.
I recognize the Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's an honour for me to provide comments on the Government of Saskatchewan's Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Amendment Act And after some brief remarks, I will move second reading of Bill 132, the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Amendment Act 2018. On December 4th, 2017, our government released Prairie Resilience, a climate change strategy designed to make Saskatchewan more resilient to the climatic, economic, and policy impacts of climate change. On October 23rd, 2018, the provincial strategy, particularly the emissions reporting requirements and the output-based performance standards for large industrial emitters, was recognized by the federal government. This means that emissions from Saskatchewan-based industries will be regulated by the provincial government, not by Ottawa. Today's Amendment Act is the next step in making possible our broad and bold strategy. It amends the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act and provides the legislative framework to enable several commitments that we made in Prairie Resilience. Portions of this act were proclaimed in December 2017, and the amendments we're discussing today further enable the legislative framework to bring our dynamic climate change strategy into action to meet the needs of our province. This includes regulations for reporting greenhouse gas emissions, reduction of industrial emissions through performance standards, and compliance options, including payments into a provincial technology fund, earning performance credits, and purchasing offset credits. Amending the Act is an important step towards fulfilling the government's promise to make Saskatchewan more resilient to the impacts of climate change. There are several specific reasons for amending the Act. First, to revise existing and overly prescriptive provisions related to the greenhouse gas reporting and methodology. Our proposed method of reporting will allow regulated emitters to report GHG emissions in the simplest and most cost-effective way possible. Second, to establish intensity-based performance standards for large emitters. This method of regulation will allow the province to reduce industrial emissions in a way that protects economic competitiveness and recognizes actions already taken by industry to lower emissions. You will recall, Mr. Speaker, that we announced these performance standards to the people of Saskatchewan in August of this year. Third, to enable compliance mechanisms for use by large emitters, including a technology fund, best performance credits, and a provincial offset system. New provisions will enable streamlined technology fund governance. This measure will reduce overhead costs and allow the majority of funding to be allocated towards innovative technology investments aimed at reducing GHG emissions. And finally, to create mechanisms for internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, often referred to as ITMOs. This is an international system that may prove to have long-term benefits for Saskatchewan companies. In addition to these amendments, several sections of the Act will be repealed to avoid layers of unnecessary administrative governance that do not align with our strategic approach. Portions of this Act were proclaimed in December 2017 to support the general and electricity producer regulations, which enable provincial regulations of emissions from coal-fired electricity generation. The amendments presented here today will not interfere with those regulations or the equivalency agreement process. They will, however, provide industry with greater flexibility to comply with the legislation and enable lower compliance costs for industry. Saskatchewan has a low-cost option to reduce emissions. A great deal of collaboration and engagement have brought us to this milestone. Many ministers, ministries, crowns, and agencies across the government of Saskatchewan work together along with industry to create and carry out Prairie Resilience. Our government began detailed engagement in February of this year with industry associations, municipal associations, agriculture and producer groups, environmental organizations, and other community representatives, including First Nations and Métis leaders, on the development of standards and measures to act on the commitments in Prairie Resilience. These consultations continued throughout the spring and summer and included stakeholder group sessions and meetings with large emitters and other interested parties. Proposed legislative changes have been shared with stakeholders, further acknowledging their contributions to these amendments. The feedback we received indicated strong support for Prairie Resilience and emphasized the importance of a flexible approach in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from large industrial emitters. That feedback was incorporated into the proposed amendments to the Act. The Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act will enable us to act on commitments made in prairie resilience and to reduce emissions in Saskatchewan without threatening the provincial economy with a tax. These amendments enable implementation of performance standards and compliance options. The proposed amendments address themes heard from stakeholders throughout the engagement process, including efficient and cost-effective GHG reporting, performance standards that respect trade and competitiveness, and support for effective compliance options. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank everyone who participated and contributed to our engagement processes, particularly our team at the Ministry of Environment for their leadership on this very important file. We continue to believe in the pragmatism of our provincial climate change strategy and will continue to follow through on our commitments made in prairie resilience. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to move second reading of Bill 132, the Management Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Amendment Act 2018.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 132 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise in response to and enter into the debate on Bill number 132, an act to amend the Management and Reduction of Greenhouse Gases Act here in Saskatchewan, here in the Chamber. A very, very important piece of legislation. I mean, and it's interesting, as the Minister spoke, so this is like a throwback Thursday. This is a third kick of the can that this government has had at this. This is something they've been working on for many, many years. And of course, we had that as well. But I do want to say that every time we get a little closer, we want to make sure we get it right. And so obviously we will have lots of comments on this and a lot of questions that need to be asked to make sure. Now I know, and the Minister did talk about how proud he was of the Prairie Resilience document. And there are many good pieces in that, but there are many pieces that are still left unaddressed. And I had some time in the spring as environment critic to pay a little bit more attention to this. And there were things in there that I think we really do need to talk about, and particularly around agriculture, particularly around water, and building, and some of those other sectors. But I know this is one that the Minister wants to get going on as quickly as possible, and in many ways it was in, as he alluded to, the response to what happened in August 29th when they announced the plan to deal with the large emitters and how to deal with that. And in many ways, it sounds appealing, but there are still some very serious questions. The one that and I said it then, and I said it to the media, and I'll say it again because this is the elephant in the room, and it's the price of carbon here in Saskatchewan per ton. What is it? How are you going to deal? What's the currency? We asked the Minister in committee last spring, how are you going to deal with the offsets and all of this? I think that the large corporations will want to know what you are talking about. And I look at the explanatory notes from the previous piece of legislation, and of course in their definitions they were as brave to say a carbon compliance price means the prescribed price to be paid to the fund for the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So, and that was not proclaimed, of course. And so this is going to be the elephant in the room. Like, how are you going to make this work? Because you've got a kind of some might say a complex, complicated, and elegant system that the large emitters can find their way to reduce or be incentivized to reduce their emissions. And that's what you want to do. At the end of the day, we want reduction of emissions. And I think everybody here wants the same thing. How can we reduce our emissions? Is it an efficiency? Is it a piece of technology that can make that happen? How do we do that? How do we change our impact on climate, particularly when we're talking about greenhouse gases? But if that's not achievable, what's the method that provides incentives for the large emitters and the mid-sized emitters to feel that they have to feel some pressure to get the job done? And what currency is that going to be? How are you going to set up the standard? At some point, it can't be so flexible that it doesn't really mean very much at all. And so that will be the question here, and I think it's one that we really do need to deal with. And it's not just the existing large emitters, but it's ones that are coming on board, like K&S Potash, relatively new, or any new mine that happens to come aboard. What's going to happen with the new emitters? What are the standards that they're going to have to be measured against? These are the questions that we have, Mr. Speaker, and they seem to be unanswered. And as I said in the spring, we still have, and we see in Prairie Resilience, the chart, the back page, and the TBDs. I know the former Minister of Environment from Martinsville mentioned that as if that was just something to blow off. Who cares? Who really cares if the chart is incomplete? I mean, it's got, and as I said, there are many good parts to the report, but there's still too many parts that need specific answers. We're getting too close where we need to know really what does the minister, what does this government really mean? And so, so these are questions that we have. Will they actually follow through with this? This is their third kick at the can of this in the last 10 years. The third kick. So if somebody, and the minister could say, well, we just started consulting just in the past year or so and look at this new document. That is fair to say. But they've had 2 other goes at this. They've had 2 other goes. So when we talk about a tired, worn out government, this is what we mean. That's right. Why couldn't they have followed through with the previous piece of legislation? Was there a problem with that? I'm not sure which of the 2 ministers were the Minister of Environment. They keep recycling through the wash. You know, one gets a little worn out, and then we have the other one come back, and then the other one comes back. So I don't know which of the ministers it was that had. So there are lots of things that we have questions about, and we're going to be having a lot of questions about. Will they actually follow through? What is the commitment that we can really say? How are we going to know that you're really going to do what you said you're going to do when this is the 3rd time? This is the 3rd time. And so I have some questions, and some of them, of course, and this is the one. You know, you got to, Mr. Speaker, can I just put this up the flagpole and say, we're watching this, we're watching this. That's right. You know, when we have, and I was reading the Act, and it talks about the public information section that we have. And it takes a look, public information, these guys have the nerve to talk about public information. Public information, and I know we have members over there kind of smiling because this is like a foreign language for us to be talking about. Because you bet $1, we're going to get into people saying, hey, we can't tell you because that's business practice. We can't tell you because it's business practice and public information. I mean, doesn't matter, you know. And Mr. Speaker, the member from Regina, Saskatoon talked about the 15th anniversary. Yeah, I remember 15 years ago when he stood up and he promised transparency and accountability. Now he's laughing. What the heck? That was then, this is now. What are we talking about? Public transparency and accountability. And here we have in this Act something called public information. I tell you, I don't know whoever thought that one up there. We'll see how much public information we ever get out of these guys on this Act. I mean, I think this is like the trap door, you know. And I looked at new section 61 is repealed and the following substituted, and they talk about, I love the language, prescribed manners. Yeah, then we have the way to close that door. People will never find out what's happening because these guys will say it's about business and we can't tell you a single thing. We can't tell you a single thing. So, Mr. Speaker, forgive me if I'm a little doubtful about the follow-through and about the transparency and accountability of this. These guys have no accountability. The land they gave away to Loblaws. Now, I don't know if they gave it away for free, for $1, or $10. How do we ever know? Because they're saying they can't tell us. They can't tell us. They gave CP 30 acres, 300 acres, wasn't it? Not 30. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, when they have lost any accountability when it comes to public information and public trust. So, Mr. Speaker, for the third count, try to get this done, I have serious questions. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I would adjourn debate on Bill number 132. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 132. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 2, the Honourable Mr. Morgan to move second reading of Bill number 133, the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018, which I will move at the end of my remarks. This bill is being introduced in the fall 2018 legislative session to change the date for the 2020 general provincial election from November 2nd to October 26th. Mr. Speaker, under the existing election laws, the 2020 provincial election would have been held 5 days after municipal elections. With this bill and the changes in the Local Government Election Amendment Act, the provincial election will now be held on October 26, 2020, with municipal and school board elections held 2 weeks later on November 9th, 2020. The amendments further provide that following 2020, future provincial elections will be held every 4 years on the last Monday in October. Future local government elections will be held on November 13, 2024, and then occur every 4 years on the second Wednesday in November. Mr. Speaker, after consulting extensively with both rural and urban municipalities, it was clear that they wanted to keep their elections in the fall of 2020, and so did we. Through this legislation, we believe that we have reached a reasonable compromise that will allow local officials time to prepare for these changes. In 1991 and 2003, the municipal and provincial elections were held roughly 2 weeks apart with no apparent problems. Fall provincial elections are preferable because they don't disrupt the legislative calendar. The elected government can still introduce the throne speech in the fall and a budget at the usual time in the following spring. Prior to the 2016 provincial election, the previous 4 elections were held in the fall. The 2016 election was in April due to a fall 2015 federal election, and this delayed the provincial budget until June. With this in mind, we have decided to schedule the provincial election before the municipal election, as holding the provincial election later would make it difficult, if not impossible, to hold a legislative session before Christmas. Mr. Speaker, this government introduced set date elections when it was first elected to prevent the uncertainty of snap elections. Making these changes 2 years before the proposed election date is consistent with this practice and will support that commitment to certainty without unduly conflicting with local government elections. With that, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of the Legislative Assembly Election Dates Amendment Act 2018.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 133 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and join in the debate around this piece of legislation. We've already had the opportunity to speak this afternoon a few times about this issue on a couple of other similar bills, Mr. Speaker. Again, I point to the fact that the election dates have been moved from less than a week apart to a whole 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker. We've been calling for what makes the most logical sense, Mr. Speaker, which is for the election, the provincial election, to be held spring of 2020. I don't know what the Sask Party are so afraid of, why they won't hold the election sooner than the fall of 2020, why they won't call the election for spring of 2020, Mr. Speaker, but it's what we've been calling for. It's what makes the most logical sense for this province. It won't impede with civic elections, Mr. Speaker. It will allow the municipal campaigns to run without having to be essentially interfered with by provincial elections. Now we're going to see, you'll be able to see somebody's house, somebody's lawn will have provincial candidates sign up, municipal candidates sign up, and a school board trustees sign up, Mr. Speaker. It was going to be very difficult for all of us. Imagine all of the door knocking that's going to be happening over those 2 weeks period, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how happy the electorate is going to be with that situation. Again, June of 2020 makes the most sense, Mr. Speaker. Why won't the Sask Party call the election sooner? What are they so afraid of, Mr. Speaker? I have an article here, and I don't always agree with him, and I don't always quote him, but Murray Mandrick wrote an article on November 2nd, and the title is Mandrick, Mo's October 2020 election date about the Sask Party, not the voters, Mr. Speaker. And that's what we're hearing from the voters as well, Mr. Speaker. They don't understand why
it's not 2 weeks, it's you, Paul.
A 2-week difference between the provincial election and the municipal election is apparently a mission accomplished banner for this government. Yeah. At least they didn't follow their buddy in Ontario, Doug Ford, Mr. Speaker, and just decide unilaterally to cut off half of the city council members.
Yeah. See, there's some good things.
In Toronto, Mr. Speaker, or just cancel the election altogether. At least we're seeing that. So at least I could say one good thing about this piece of legislation. It's nice that they didn't at least do that, Mr. Speaker. Murray Mandrick in his column says that, and quote, historically, the highest vote turnouts in Saskatchewan have been, unsurprisingly, in June when it's easiest for voters to vote. But it's never really about the voters, is it? End quote, Mr. Speaker. Why would the Sask Party be choosing an election date that doesn't have historically high voter turnouts? Why wouldn't they be choosing June of 2020 when there's a better chance for high voter turnouts, Mr. Speaker? That's really the question that the province, that the people of this province are asking and are left with, Mr. Speaker. Looking forward to having more dialogue with this issue. I know it sounds like members from other side really want to partake in this dialogue as well. So I'm hoping that they do that with their constituents and they can hear the concerns that we've been hearing from stakeholders, from individual mayors, from city councillors, town councillors, school board trustees, Mr. Speaker. So with that, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on this bill.
Hear, hear.
The member has moved to adjourn debate on Bill number 133. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 5. The Honourable Mr. Harrison to move second reading of Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018.
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Partnership.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to move second reading of the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. This new act will replace the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 1999, which will be repealed upon the new act coming into force. All changes proposed to this act have been industry-driven and endorsed by our stakeholders. Before I dive into the details of these changes, I want to provide some context on what the role of the Saskatchewan Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Commission, or SATCC, is, as well as what apprenticeship is. The SATCC is an industry-led, Government of Saskatchewan commission that performs 4 main roles. They train apprentices, certify apprentices and tradespeople, including those trained outside the province or country, regulate the apprenticeship system of training, and promote apprenticeship. In short, the commission, led by an industry representative board of directors, oversees the apprenticeship and certification system in our province. Apprenticeship is a post-secondary education pathway. It's specifically designed to allow learners to work in their field while they develop advanced skills. Apprenticeship is a 3 to 5 year work-based system whereby 85% of the training happens on the job under the supervision of a trained journey person or mentor. Supervision ensures work is done correctly and in accordance with safety standards and industry codes. Typically, once per year, apprentices attend technical training for 6 to 10 weeks to learn the theoretical underpinnings of their job. Once an apprentice has successfully acquired all of the necessary trade time hours and has completed all required technical training for their trade, they are eligible to take the journeyperson certification exam. Upon successful completion, they become certified journeypersons. There are more than 40 designated trades and subtrades in Saskatchewan. Most are non-compulsory, meaning that apprenticeship and certification is not required to work in the trade. However, there are currently 4 trades designated as compulsory in our province. Compulsory status means those who wish to work in the trade must be apprentices or a certified journeyperson. The 4 compulsory trades in Saskatchewan are construction electrician, plumber, sheet metal worker, and refrigeration and air conditioning mechanic. In non-compulsory trades, certification can be achieved through apprenticeship or through the trade qualifier pathway. Experienced tradespeople who have gained the required number of trade time hours can apply to see if they qualify to challenge the journeyperson certification exam for their trade. If they qualify and successfully challenge the exam, they will receive their journeyperson certification. The SATCC proposed 3 substantive legislative changes and led extensive stakeholder consultations on these amendments, and all proposed changes have been endorsed by industry. These changes will modernize the Act, which is nearly 2 decades old. They will enhance the regulatory function of the Commission and position the Act to address current and future industry realities. These changes are designed to affirm the integrity of the apprenticeship model by ensuring apprentices and consumers are benefiting from a journeyperson at the worksite, standardized training and industry standards across trades, and enhanced safety for Saskatchewan residents and workers. The first proposed change will allow the SATCC to designate and certify occupations and subtrades in addition to trades, and is the direct response to requests from industry to pursue this enhancement. Occupations require specialized skill sets. The ability to become certified in an occupation will demonstrate to both employers and consumers that someone has the necessary skills and knowledge to perform the job safely and effectively. Designating occupations and subtrades professionalizes these important jobs. It also improves labour mobility, since many provinces already recognize and designate a variety of occupations. Now designation will rely on industry demand. An application demonstrating strong support will need to be completed by members of industry in order to request an occupation or subtrade designation. The SATCC and its Board of Directors make decisions in response to industry demand. To give you an idea of what might be possible, overhead door technician is an example of an occupation that could be designated. Someone working in this occupation has the ability to enhance their skills and demonstrate their expertise through training and certification, which provides confidence to employers and consumers of these services and provides a certification pathway for the workers performing this important work. Mr. Speaker, the second substantive change to the Act will provide the Commission the authority to designate trades, subtrades, and occupations for certification only. In other words, the SATCC will be able to administer certification exams and offer certification without having to provide and develop corresponding training programs. This will be useful when there's not enough demand to run a full apprenticeship training program. I'll use concrete finisher as an example. This trade, at industry's request, was de-designated in the province in January 2009. Since it was de-designated, there is currently no path forward to certification for skilled tradespeople in Saskatchewan. However, were it to be designated as a trade for certification only, skilled tradespeople who have gained a substantial number of trade time hours working as concrete finishers could challenge the certification exam and become journeypersons. This would provide the same certification had they completed a formal apprenticeship program. The SATCC is not interested in moving away from apprenticeship training. That is and always will be one of its core roles. However, where it's not feasible because of a lack of demand to offer a complete apprenticeship training program, this amendment provides experienced skilled workers with a way to achieve certification. The third substantive change will provide the Commission the authority to issue work cessation orders if, during an on-site work inspection, it's determined there's no journeyperson present at a work site to supervise an apprentice in a compulsory trade. Remember, there are 4 compulsory trades in the province. This amendment applies only to those 4 trades. When apprentices are left unsupervised, unsafe situations and poor workmanship could result. Cessation orders improve safety and learning for apprentices and also reduce safety risks for consumers. Work cessation orders allow the Commission to more effectively enforce the existing legislation, stipulating that in compulsory trades, apprentices must be supervised on-site by a journey person. This amendment provides the SATCC with the ability to resolve unsafe situations by stopping the work of apprentices in compulsory designated trades until such a time as a journey person returns to the site to provide necessary supervision. This amendment strengthens the regulatory authority and supplements the Commission's ability to levy fines which do not have the same immediate impact to protect worker and consumer safety. Historically, the vast majority of work sites visited by Commission staff members are in compliance. However, in the interest of safety, 100% compliance is desirable. In addition to these 3 substantive changes, there are a number of general housekeeping amendments which will update the Act to reflect current legislative language. Again, these are necessary improvements endorsed by industry. These changes improve labour mobility, enhance worker and consumer safety, and ensure industry employs a skilled and certified workforce. Mr. Speaker, I now move the second reading of the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 136 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to join debate today on Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018. Just in general, Mr. Speaker, I think that it's something that we have agreement on in both sides of the House in terms of the great success that the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Commission has been for many years now. And one of the key ingredients to that success, Mr. Speaker, is the way that it's not just a business organization, it's not just an organized labor organization, it's not just an educational, institutional organization, Mr. Speaker. It does a pretty good job of balancing and combining all of those interests into what has been a fairly successful cooperative venture, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, not just providing, you know, good, solid education in the province of Saskatchewan for Saskatchewan people to get the skills, to do the jobs, to make our economy more productive and grow, Mr. Speaker, but also certainly the way that that work is recognized across the country. Via the Red Seal process and via the different labour mobility agreements that we as Saskatchewan people are party to. Mr. Speaker, we'll be looking in the days ahead to do some consulting on this piece of legislation to make sure that that balance that has been there is you know, continuing forth. And also, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that the great features around, I think of things like the apprenticeship to master trades certification, if there's been any sort of change with the ratios there, Mr. Speaker, because of course that's a critical part of the way that the education and learning and the skilling up is transmitted under the apprenticeship process, Mr. Speaker. And again, we'll be looking to make sure that it's not just and again, not to take anything away from the minister, but to make sure that it's not just the minister's say-so, but to make sure that that partnership, which again has been enduring and successful, is only going forward able to do more good work on the behalf of the people of Saskatchewan. So Mr. Speaker, we've got, you know, the first glance at the legislation and listening to the minister's second reading speech here today. Again, there are some good things in terms of, you know, the clarification that goes on with any organization or piece of legislation and keeping it up with the times. But again, Mr. Speaker, we want to do that work of due diligence, talking to the partners to make sure that the success of the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Commission is built upon and only goes forward to more success, Mr. Speaker. So with that, we will certainly look forward to the comments and insights on offer from various of my colleagues, but again, Mr. Speaker, doing that work of due diligence, doing that work of consultation and verification to make sure that this is as it seems to be, and it only builds upon the success of the Commission and doesn't detract from it in any way, shape or form. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd move to adjourn debate on Bill number 136, the Apprenticeship and Trade Certification Act 2018.
The member has moved adjournment on Bill number 136. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 7. The Honourable Ms. Eyre to move second reading of Bill number 137, the Sask Energy Miscellaneous Amendment Act 2018.
I recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to move second reading of Bill 137, the Sask Energy Amendment Act 2018. There are 2 amendments to Sask Energy's Act in the bill. Section 24, which involves Sask Energy's gas distribution and transportation franchise, and Section 42, which deals with an expansion of Sask Energy's debt limit. Section 24, Mr. Speaker, builds on the changes made last year to the Sask Energy Act. You'll recall that last year's amendments helped to modernize Sask Energy's legislation to better reflect current business needs. All changes were made while still protecting the corporation's franchise obligations. Those amendments were made to enhance specific safety measures and to address the needs of the enhanced oil recovery sector. The changes also supported innovative new projects involving the trucking of liquefied natural gas and compressed natural gas for temporary use purposes. All the previous amendments addressed challenges Sask Energy was facing at the time. The proposed amendment to Section 24 in Bill 137 looks ahead to the future. The change will establish a framework to allow Sask Energy to continue to protect its distribution and transportation franchise while also supporting the innovation that will allow our energy sector to continue to play a vital role in our economy. While we were before committee last session, we look back at 1992, when the first Sask Energy Act was introduced, and how the natural gas industry has seen such major changes since that time. There are processes undertaken in the energy sector today that no one could have envisioned. Increasingly, initiatives and programs are arising in the industry that fall outside the corporation's core business, but still fall within its legislation. This includes emerging projects such as the previously stated approach to using LNG and CNG as a fuel source, projects that benefit the industry, the province, and support emissions reduction efforts. And it's important that our Crown corporations be in a position to support and encourage industry developments such as these. The Section 24 amendment will establish a more efficient process that will allow new initiatives to proceed in a timely manner. In all cases, this new process must still protect Sask Energy's franchise, while at the same time creating a review and approval framework that is more streamlined. The proposed amendments would allow the corporation to request a single order in Council to approve a new program. Once the OC was issued, Sask Energy could then approve third-party projects that meet the determined requirements without the need for further OCs. This will ensure that each new project doesn't involve multiple orders in Council or having to reopen the Sask Energy Act to create a new exception. By modernizing the Act, the Sask Energy Corporation can better support innovative new business ventures in the province as and when they arise. Mr. Speaker, just as the first proposed amendment is vital to supporting industry growth, the second amendment to Section 42 is key to supporting the internal growth of Sask Energy's natural gas system across the province. This amendment would increase Sask Energy's debt limit from $1.7 billion to $2.5 billion. The change addresses the ongoing capital needs of the corporation's natural gas pipeline system due to high levels of customer growth. This growth includes residential and commercial customers, but also the major industrial sectors of enhanced oil recovery and power production. To ensure the energy infrastructure is available to meet these needs, Sask Energy must continue to invest in system expansion. With today's pace of growth, Sask Energy is projected to exceed its current debt limit by the 2021-22 fiscal year. Increasing that limit will help ensure that Sask Energy continues to be able to meet these growing demands into the future, allowing it to proactively plan ahead. Mr. Speaker, the amendments put forth in Bill 137 are intended to address modern industry needs, better align the Sask Energy Act with Crown priorities, and ensure that Sask Energy's core operations and franchise rights remain strongly in place. The changes will also make the corporation's powers consistent with other Crown's legislation and will allow Sask Energy to continue to operate safely and efficiently in the best interest of all customers. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to move second reading of Bill 137, the Sask Energy Amendment Act 2018.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 137 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter into the debate on second reading of Bill number 137, an act to amend the Sask Energy Act, and it's a short act, and I appreciate the comments by the minister. It's so interesting how a minister can dress up something that I think really, if there's ever a Trojan horse, this may be it. This may be it. I thought the question, the answer or the reply, I hesitate to use the word answer and question period because that seems so foreign to many of the folks over there, but they do give replies. They do give replies. But the question today about the visionary thinking about how we should be looking at the pipelines in this province and making sure that they're strong and resilient and secure. And the minister, in her hyperbole, really just kind of blew it out of the water and was all really worried about driving Sask Energy into huge debt. And then in the afternoon, she gets up and say, hey, how about $2.5 billion bucks? How about $2.5 billion debt limit, Mr. Speaker? Isn't that amazing? And she's just asking us to say, hey, that's just great, increasing it from $1.75 billion to $2.5 billion. You know, Mr. Speaker, forgive us if we're a little worried about this and where she's going with this and this kind of preparation and the kind of attitude she has about about climate change and making sure that the pipelines are working well, and yet she can stand there and say $2.5 billion, and people of Saskatchewan, you better be ready to see that on your Sask Energy bills, because we know who will pay for it. Who will pay for it? Of course, it'll be the residents of this province. And these people came, I don't remember this being part of the election. I don't remember this being part of the election. No wonder they want to put the election 6 months later than it should be. I understand where she's coming from with this on, Mr. Speaker. When you increase a debt limit like this, you really hope people forget. It's like the PST, and you add $1 billion on new taxes, and they hope people forget. They hope people forget. Mr. Speaker, we have a lot of questions about this piece of legislation, and we better be ready to hear all those questions and have the minister give a reasonable response, because she's the one who talked about voodoo or witchcraft when it came to climate change, and she said she was just joking, but yet she wrote a column about that, and then she has the nerve to get up and call other people out on that, Mr. Speaker. I'm worried about that kind of leadership over there. But the other one, when I talk about the Trojan horse, is this, and the minister went on about section 24 being amended. And here it's, and I'll read this so the people at home know what we're talking about. The following subsection is added after subsection 24, 1.1. An approval by the Lieutenant Governor in Council pursuant to subsection may be made with respect to a particular case or may be made in general in nature. Now, Mr. Speaker, when I look at the explanation, this is what's given. Subsection, and I quote, subsection 1.1 is new. It will allow the corporation to request an order in Council to generally approve a program or initiative without the need for additional specific orders in Council for each individually approved participant in such programs. So where is the transparency and accountability there, Mr. Speaker? Out the window. Out the window. They're just going to be able to, down at Sask Energy or in the minister's office, approve these things without anybody ever really knowing what's going on in Sask Energy, our publicly owned Crown corporation. Is that the way we do business in Saskatchewan? It may be the way those guys do it, and we have seen it with Loblaws here, where we don't know how much they paid for that land that Sask Party gave them. Was it $1? Was it free? Was it $10? Who really knows? And they say, hey, it's just a business deal. We want to make sure that we follow those old protocols. But in Saskatchewan, you know what's really important, and listen to this. You know, I listen to the member from Moosha. I don't know when he'll ever, Moosha North, when he'll ever get into cabinet to straighten these folks out. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, but with his business sense, I don't think it's real soon, Mr. Speaker. I don't think it's real soon. But I am worried about how those folks, when they were elected, they said it's all about transparency and accountability. And where is it? Where is it in this legislation? Where is their accountability to their shareholders, the people of Saskatchewan? They say, we're just going to give you a blank check to do whatever you want. Now, we raised concern with that bill that they brought forward last year because it seemed like it was a Trojan horse for privatization. They assured it wasn't because it was innovative projects like LNG and enhanced oil recovery and that type of thing. Yeah, that's the start. But then we have a little bit of mission creep and we start wondering what's happening behind the doors of Sask Energy when they don't have to share it with anybody like they used to through orders in Council. There will not be accountability anymore, Mr. Speaker. It's our job over here, Mr. Speaker, to raise that concern. Because you know what? We've seen this too often from the folks over there about, you know, accountability, transparency, because they're on the side of people, of the people making sure they get the full information. Have we got full information about the bypass? No. Have we got full information about the GTH? No, not at all. They all say it's because of business practices. Well, I tell you, Mr. Speaker, as we've said, the Minister of Justice should stick to selling turkeys. That's what he should do, Mr. Speaker, and not this kind of stuff here. Maybe he wants to branch out to his colleague in Saskatoon Stonebridge and get her selling a few turkeys. Maybe that might be a deal. But, Mr. Speaker, I have real concerns about this kind of legislation. So, with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move adjournment on an act to amend the Sask Energy Act. Thank you.
The member has moved adjournment of debate on Bill 137. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Second readings, item number 8. The Honourable Mr. Morgan to move second reading of Bill number 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to be moving, at the close of my remarks, second reading of Bill 139, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Amendment Act 2018. The key amendment is to establish a new appeal process based on the principles of administrative fairness. All appeals will be heard by an independent third-party adjudicator. The amendments included in the bill are the result of a review conducted by the Ministry of Labour, Relations and Workplace Safety after it assumed responsibility for administration of the Act in the 2017-18 budget. The Act discourages unethical practices and protects foreign workers from exploitation and mistreatment during the recruitment and immigration process. It also builds transparency and accountability to immigration consulting and recruitment services. Mr. Speaker, I'd note that once foreign workers are employed in Saskatchewan, they are protected by the same employment standards and occupational health and safety provisions as any other employee in the province. The Saskatchewan Employment Act includes an appeal process for decisions of the Directors of Employment Standards and Occupational Health and Safety. Those processes were used as a blueprint in the development of a new appeals process under the Act. The amendment will outline the procedure for hearing an appeal and define the powers of the adjudicator. Our goal in making this change was to ensure that the process was fair and transparent for everyone involved. We have also clarified in the Act the Director's authority to request information from a third party when investigating a possible violation of the Act. This will allow us to seek information from, for example, financial institutions or telephone companies when conducting an investigation. Mr. Speaker, the Act was introduced to protect vulnerable workers. This amendment strengthens the Act, thereby strengthening our ability to ensure unscrupulous parties are not taking advantage of foreign workers or immigrants. It also levels the playing field for the nearly 400 active recruiters and consultants operating in the province, and over 3,300 employees who are registered, the majority of whom are looking out for the best interests of their clients and employees. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of this bill.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 139 be now read a second time. Assembly ready for the question. Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to again join debate this afternoon on Bill number 139, an act to amend the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigration Services Act. Again, I thank the Minister for the remarks on the piece of legislation at this time. And certainly in a broad sense, Mr. Speaker, there are many things that the Minister talked about that we certainly can agree with as an official opposition. In terms of the question of the appropriate and rightful treatment of foreign workers in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, again, is as old as the province of Saskatchewan itself. And for the great majority of experiences that are working out for folks that come to Saskatchewan, and again, in the place where our motto is from many people's strength, those many peoples that came, there is, when you're far from home, and in many cases on your own, Mr. Speaker, there is a vulnerability that accompanies that circumstance. And in terms of the great calling card there is that a job in a place like Saskatchewan has, in the way that should serve as a ladder to up in terms of citizenship, in terms of more engagement with the broader society, and that we as a society might benefit from that skilled labor, the work to be done, but also, and again, Mr. Speaker, you know this very well, not to involve you in the debate or anything, but certainly the way that from those many people we not only draw strength, but we draw enjoyment, we draw diversity, we draw all the things that make Saskatchewan such a great place. And that diversity really is a strength, as is often stated across the piece. But in terms of people that are coming in, and sometimes, and there's an ebb and flow to these things as well, Mr. Speaker, but in terms of the greater or lesser number of foreign workers that are coming, to make sure that people that are providing those immigration services are doing so in a scrupulous, fair, and above-board manner, Mr. Speaker, that, and we don't have to look very far to see circumstances where those kind of activities can go badly wrong. and of course it's the workers that pay the price for that, and we all pay a price for that in terms of